Hello everyone. Today we're going to learn how to target HTML code from our CSS style sheet. Or in other words, how do we use CSS selectors? Now there are three different types of CSS selectors. There are elements, there are classes, which are a group of elements, and there's an ID. And we're going to go over how to target each of those. So first we're going to start here in our body tags in our index.html file. And we're going to start with a heading 1. And in this heading 1, we're going to call it box 1. And then after the heading, we're going to have a paragraph with lorem, right? So you run that, and it's going to show you what's on the screen right now, okay? Now we're going to do this another time, a second time. We're going to do heading 1 again. And instead, now we're going to call it box 2. And in here, we're going to do another paragraph. Okay? All right. So now let's say I want to change the color of box 1. So first, I actually want to make sure that these two things, these two elements, that they are part of one box, right? So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a division tag, which what that does is it makes a new section of the website. So in this case, we're going to use a division tag, and we're going to use the attribute class, and we're going to set that equal to whatever we want this div section to be named. Okay, and I'm going to call this box 1. Okay, and so I'm going to close that, and then I'm going to close it around here. So that means we're wrapping it around these two contents, the heading and the paragraph. Okay, so let me go ahead and tab that so you can see. We're going to do the same thing for box 2. So I do a div class, set it equal to box 2, close it in, and make sure you close in the tag after the content that you want in box 2. So now if we run that, it's going to do nothing on the browser, but now the computer or your browser actually knows that this box right here, this information, not box, this information is part of a section of the browser, which is called box 1. And then these, this paragraph and this heading right here is all part of one class called box 2. So basically what you're doing with classes is you're categorizing them to fall under one, let's say one, well, category, for lack of better words, which you can use to target in CSS. Now, if we go to CSS, what we can do is we can target classes by using a dot. So when we're using classes, we have to use a dot and then actually write your class. So let's say I only want box 1 to everything in box 1 to change the color to purple. So I'm going to go ahead and use a dot to make sure that my browser knows that this is a class. I'm going to write the class name, then I'm going to add some curly brackets and click enter. Now whatever is inside the curly brackets is called a declaration. Now the way you do a declaration is you have a property and then you set that property equal to a value. So one property we have is color. So we can set this color property equal to, and the equal sign in this case is a colon, but we set the color equal to, what did we say? I don't remember the color. Let's just do blue, because I don't remember what color I said. So now when we run that, everything that is under the class box 1 is going to change to the color blue. As you can see, these two contents, the heading and the paragraph, are within this box 1 class. That's why when we write box 1, it's not doing anything to the box 2 heading or the paragraph 2 heading because they're in a different class. They're a different group of elements. You can think of them as groups. Now, if we want to actually change everything in box 2, we're going to do box 2. Okay, and then let's say we want box 2 to be red. Okay, so now all it does is it changes the color of every content or every element in that class or in that group or in that division, whichever way you want to think of it as. Okay, Now, let's say I want to target only the heading of box 2. So the way I do that is the same thing. I first target the class, so box 2, then I target the actual heading, which is the heading 1. And then you do the curly brackets, and then you can change it to whatever property you want. So let's say I want the paragraph to be red, but I specifically want the heading to be purple. Okay? And when we do that, it turns into purple. Okay? And also notice that we have to end our declarations with a semicolon, otherwise it won't. Well, sometimes it does, but you just want to make sure that you're ending it with a semicolon so no errors happen, no unnecessary errors happen, okay? All right, so that's a little explanation there, but let's get a little bit more into it. Let's go back to our HTML code and let's actually do a few buttons. So let's do a button 1. Okay, copy and paste that 3 times and then change it to button 2, button 3, and button 4. Okay, now when we run that, we're going to see button 1, button 2, button 3, and button 4 in our browser. Now what we want to do is first think to yourself, okay, maybe I just want to change any button elements. I want to apply a certain property. I want all my button elements to be the color, let's say orange. So, okay, well, we know that there's only these buttons, right? These elements here. These are the only buttons on our page, so that makes sense. So we can use an element as a selector. So let's use an element as a selector right now. Let me note that. And let me actually do the same thing here so we know what we're working with. So this is selector class. Okay. So when we use an element as a selector, basically what we're doing is we're saying, okay, well, whatever style or declaration that I, for lack of better words, declare inside the curly brackets, it's going to apply to every single element that I specify. So in this case, the buttons. So every button is going to have this style. So I'm going to go ahead and do color, and I'm going to set it equal to orange, and then a semicolon, and then I'm going to run it. And you're going to see that every single button now has orange text inside. Okay, so notice that for an element, you do not need to add a dot or anything before the actual selector, okay? So again, this acts as our selector, this acts as our declaration, the color is our property, and orange is our value. Okay. So no matter where a button is on your browser, it's going to change colors. So even if it's within another class, let's actually add a button in this box 1. Let's just say button 0. Close that in and run that. Even if we add it in another class, it's still going to apply the style because we specified that whatever is a button, no matter where it is, it's going to have the color orange, okay? So that's what that does. But let's say we want to only work with this button right here. Let's say we only want to style this button. We don't want it to have the color orange, but we do want to keep these buttons 1 through 4 color orange, but we just want to specifically change this color right here. We can do this 2 ways. We could either target this button here using the class. We can do box1, then button, or we can give this a special ID. So an ID is basically the same thing as a class, except that it's singular. It only applies to one element. So it's something that you're going to only see once in your entire web page, okay? So it's not like a style that you're going to use multiple times, right? So in this case, we're going to give this an ID of button 0, so btn 0. And we're going to go back to our CSS and we're going to do an ID. Actually, to target an ID, you have to use a hashtag. So btn0. And now let's change the color to, let's say, green. Now it's going to change to the color green. Notice that it didn't change any of these buttons here because we did not target, even though it is a button, we didn't target the button element itself, we targeted its ID, okay? Now I'm going to show you actually how to do this the other way without an ID. You could simply just target it from box 1 and then button. So let's go back here. We could do box 1, the class, and then then target the element button, and then color, let's do green, right? And let me delete this so you know that it's not this that's actually doing it. Run it. And once it loads, give it a second. Oh, sorry about that. It's supposed to be box 1 without a space. Okay, there we go. We see that it works here. So we see that it's green, but just to try it again, let's actually do yellow so you can see that it really works here. So now you can see yellow. I mean, you can't really see it that clearly, but let's go ahead and put that back to green so we can see it more clearly, and we can target it that way. It is recommended to do it this way rather than give it an ID because sometimes you can get a little bit confused with IDs. IDs, we rarely use them. We mostly use classes, and then we target anything within the classes after the class itself, okay? All right, so we use a class as a selector. We use the element as a selector. We also used an ID as a selector. Let me actually add that section here. And then we actually used selector nesting. This is what nesting is called when you have, nested elements. So you're basically, if you actually hover over it, it actually tells you what you're putting in. So this is the element class equals box 1, and then within that class you have an actual button. So that's what you're applying it to. So you can even follow the path. So you can think of it as a path, or you can think of it as a nest, as a nest, right? Because you're nesting elements on top of each other. But let me actually take this, return this here. So we had what, button 0, and let's do color coral. Let's actually go back to index.html and make another button here. Give it an ID. Let's change the actual ID. Let's do button 00. So let's do btn 00 and then call it just button. Now if you run that, you can see now that what we put here for an ID, color coral, it applied to the actual button, right? Because we actually put an ID here. If we remove the ID, all that's going to do is going to turn it back to green because we said that whatever button inside box 1 is going to be green. We said that right here. So whatever button inside box 1 or inside the class box 1 or the group of elements in named box 1, you can say it in a billion different ways. It should be green, right? Every button should be green. Okay? And that's how that works.